I'm Femi OK. It has been more than 2 months since protesters across Colombia hit the streets and overturned a tax reform proposal. But the demonstrators didn't go home and the activists' demands have grown. So we are asking right now, what is it that the government response is going to be like? How are the protesters dealing with it? And what are they asking for right now on today's episode of The Stream? We start in Bogota with 2 demonstrators.
The most important thing is to make visible all the abuses that have taken place in our country. There have been many cases of abuse. We as a people have the right to protest. The Constitution says we have rights, and at this moment we are not supported. We are fighting for the rights we have had for many years.
This is an indolent state. It is a state that doesn't talk to the people. It talks through force and weapons. We want peace, democracy, life. We don't want a state of terror. We don't want a state where people are murdered, but where there are minimum guarantees. They cannot assassinate the youth, who are the future of this country.
To help us cover the protests in Colombia, we have Christina, Elizabeth, Nathalie. So good to have all of you. Christina, first of all, introduce yourself to our stream audience. And in the context of this protest, tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is Christina Noriega, and I'm a freelance journalist based in Bogota, Colombia, who has been covering the protests for the past 2 months.
Good to have you. Hello, Elizabeth. Introduce yourself to the stream audience.
Really great to be here. Thanks for the chance. My name is Elizabeth Dickinson. I'm senior analyst for Colombia at International Crisis Group. We're a conflict prevention organization, and I've spent the last 2 months following protests across the country, both in rural and urban areas.
Good to have you. And Nathalie, explain your connection to the current protests in Colombia and introduce yourself to our international audience.
Thank you, Femi. I'm Natalie Espitia Diaz, and one of the members of Noise Radio, which is an independent collective based in Cali, Colombia. And we're not only covering the protests, we are actually doing different activities around the different poison resistance in the city.
So, yes, I have an idea of why these protests are ongoing, why people didn't just go home and say, wow, that was amazing. We actually succeeded. We overturned the tax reform proposal. My idea is it's COVID. But if you're watching right now and you're on YouTube, you can jump into our comment section, ask our guests your questions and be part of today's show. Elizabeth, I'm thinking that COVID is connected to why people didn't go home. These demands have grown. Your take?
Absolutely. So I think the way that it was described to me, I thought very well by one of the protesters that I spoke to in Cali, which has been the epicenter of the protests. It's a city on the Pacific coast where Nathalie, who's with us today, is based. The way that she explained it to me was really the tax reform that sparked these protests. It simply uncovered our eyes to the broad array of injustices and inequalities that really characterize Colombia. This is a country with very limited social mobility. Access to education, to the job market is extremely limited. And on top of that, as you mentioned, a year of worsening pandemic. So the pandemic has hit Colombia so hard. We've had on and off lockdowns that affected the most vulnerable the most of all. Why? Because informal jobs, those people cannot afford to stay home. They can't work virtually. Income groups in the lowest income groups in Colombia were far more likely to become ill, to not have access to medical care, and to lose their jobs during the pandemic. So all the inequalities that existed already in society, they were exposed by the pandemic and worsened. So that is why I think the crisis today has really risen to such an extent that it requires a response in order to move forward.
Christina, as you're doing your reporting, how are you making it make sense for the people who are following your reporting? What are you saying is the reason why more than 2 months later, there were so many demands from all over the country and for so many groups?
From what I've seen in my reporting is that there are also a lot of people on the ground, community members in marginalized neighborhoods who feel like they've gone unheard for a very long time. They want to make sure that these protests don't end without some of their demands being heard. And some of the demands are very local and unique to their communities. These are also neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of unemployment. poverty, and they want to make sure that their demands are also heard.
Nathalie, you are in a place that has become the epicenter of protests and demonstrations. It's a place called Cali. Can you tell me a little bit more about Puntos de Resistencia? It is a very special place, and how that situation happened is part of what fuels the current protests. There are no police there now, right?
Sure. What the point of resistance, the punto de resistencia in Cali, at what point we had more than 25, I think so. As of right now, most of the point of resistance are not there anymore, like block roads, but they're still fighting back with different artistic and cultural activities and different assemblies with the people that are like joining forces to represent all the voices that we had in this city. And they're all over our city. They're all over the place in Cali, in the north, in the western part of the city, in the south part of the city. And they are just places where the community gathers to talk to each other, to see what's next, to share food, to do different performance, to read, to build libraries, and also to protest. And I think this gathering in these different points that, as I said, they are in the different parts of the city, because we see each other, because we can talk with each other, because we are building something together that is making these neighborhoods that Christina just said, they're neighborhoods that their lack of access to education, to employment, is the thing that is just really, really maintaining the strike, because we know that we can do different and amazing things for our neighborhoods and for our people here if we join forces.
Nathalie, can you list all of the things that you want? Actually, let's do 5. Just do it on one hand, because you might not have enough hands. 5 immediately that you want as an activist from your government right now.
5 things that I want from I think one of the most important things, and you just mentioned it before we went live, is that I think there's a lot of disinformation going around on what is happening in Colombia and what had happened in Colombia before the strike started. So I think one of the things is to hold the government accountable for all the things that are happening, not only as of right now during the strike, all the human rights violation, but all the things that the government is not doing. There are employees that should be covering all our human rights. You know, there should be taking our taxes and put it into education, into culture, into all the different things that we need. And they're not doing that job. And a lot of people that are paying taxes, and we all, as Colombia, we all pay taxes, is that we don't see that money anywhere. So one of the things that help the government accountable, the other one is to see the government not putting out disinformation or misinformation out. I think the other thing is to really hear the people, you know, because they just don't want to hear anyone. They just building things with each other, with the people that they want to hear, with the richest people here, with the people that are in power. So we really need to build together. We are a really diverse country, and Cali is a really diverse city. So we need to really create spaces to build together and to listen to each other. And the other thing is to just stop funding the police with all this
Nathalie,
massive.
I'm going to come to that, because part of what's fueled these demonstrators is how the police has reacted and how the government has reacted. I'm just going to bring in the voice of Cruz, and then I'm going to go straight to you, Elizabeth. Have a listen to Cruz, and then come off the back in terms of the government response to these protests. Here's Cruz.
So a lot of the protesters are young people who feel left out of the economic system. They feel left out of the COVID recovery. They feel left out of the implementation of the peace accords. And then another demand has been an end to the criminalization of protests that we've seen has surged in response to the protests So this has been the repression that everyone's seen from the SMAT, from the riot police, from just the rhetoric being used by the Duque administration that criminalizes protesters. And instead of responding to that, the Duque administration has responded with anti-riot law, which labels the protesters urban terrorists, and it tries to prohibit already legal forms of protest.
Elizabeth, how would you describe the government response to demonstrations?
Well, I think, one of the reasons that this crisis has become so entrenched is that from the beginning, the government hasn't seen it as a political crisis, but rather as a security crisis. And because of that viewpoint, they've leaned very heavily on the police in an attempt to control the protests. But what's happening on the streets is not a security crisis. It is a deep social and political cry from the vast majority of Colombians to be heard and to have real solutions. And so the reliance on the police has, in fact, entrenched the protests. And I think it created this second set of grievances. So the way that we think about it is that the sort of socioeconomic frustrations, the difficulties of sort of daily life really form the base of why people are on the street. But the reason they stayed on the street was because of police brutality. And now that has emerged as perhaps the single most unifying grievance among the protesters, is to have accountability for the way that the police has responded. How have they responded? Sometimes actively firing on protesters, using non-lethal weapons inappropriately. So, for example, shooting tear gas at close range or in very dense neighborhoods. I think it's worth stating that the police in Colombia were created at a time of armed conflict. And in many ways, the institution continues to operate on that model. It hasn't had this hard moment of examination after the peace accord in 2016 was signed that ended that armed conflict about what does it look like for a police to act in a country that is in peace. And so the relationship between citizens and the police continues to be very conflictual.
Christina, let me show you this here. There's some headlines which I'm absolutely sure that you are familiar with and you've been reporting on. Colombian press under attack in national strikes. Colombia, egregious police abuses against protesters. One more headline here. Colombians have thronged to anti-government protests. Hundreds have gone missing. Christina, how do hundreds go missing? Where have they gone? What is happening?
What a lot of human rights organizations have been saying is that police will arbitrarily arrest protesters, and then these protesters are taken to police stations, but then reports of the detained, it ends there. There are no more reports of what happens to them after that, and that's how a lot of these protesters go missing. And so a lot of these human rights organizations have had to communicate with police stations to figure out where these protesters are detained and where they are located.
I want to bring in here the presidential advisor. His name is Emilio Archilo, and he has been in dialogue. He's been having conversations with the protesters, but it looks like now the government are taking a much firmer line. Have a listen, have a look.
There can be no more roadblocks. They are illegal. They are violent and are not a peaceful way to protest. If they happen, authorities have to abide by the law. This means being very firm against those who do not protest in a peaceful manner, firmer against vandals, and the firmest against those who commit terrorist acts while taking advantage of the peaceful protests.
Nathalie, this is intriguing because the government spokesperson, he's saying, who's supposed to be talking to the protesters, is calling some of the acts terrorist acts, but there have been people who've been killed during these protests. So where is the violence happening? Is it happening on both sides? Is this an overreaction from the government? Are they just trying to stop the protesters? How do you see this?
I think a lot of people can agree with me, is that it's been an over-violence coming from the government and overreaction coming from the government. And I think it's misleading when he says that the block roars are violence, because the block roars are not violence. They're just places where people gather together, and those are the same things that, for example, restaurants do. But because they don't want people to tell what is happening, what all the things that the government are doing, all the things that the government should be implemented with the peace agreement are not doing. So they say this is something very violent. But in the Blood Rose, they're just doing the same thing that La Guardia Indígena, for example, does, that is coming from an approach of non-violence thing. And the only way that things really turn violence is when the police people and the smart people gets there and start to attack the people that are on the Blood Rose. So when they're saying that this is a place for violence, they're the ones creating violence. They're the ones trying to put something in our mouths and blocking us and telling that you should be silent. You shouldn't paint anything in your city. You shouldn't do blog posts. The independent media, they shouldn't talk. They're putting a ban shadow in the social media. They're putting a sham battle on the independent media. It's because they want us to be quiet, and we're not going to let them to do that to us. And that's when they say that we are violent, because we just going to scream and just want to tell them what is really, really happening here.
Femi, if I could jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth, and then Christina, you follow on. Elizabeth.
Well, so I just wanted to draw on what Natalie was saying, because I think, one of the things that has been very distinct about this protest movement is the use of blockades. So blockades within cities and blockades between cities. And I think it's useful to think about why this is the form of protest that has arisen at this moment. And I think it very much relates to some things that Christina and Natalie were saying about how communities want to take back their own economy. Their own autonomy. So when these blockades emerged, essentially it was a way to create a space in which citizens could be safe to organize, safe to have conversations, safe to set their own futures and to determine their own goals. These are in areas where, you talk to youth and they just feel they have no control over their life. They have no access to higher education. They have no access to the job market. They are segregated in parts of the city that are stigmatized as being criminal or stigmatized as being so poor, that they'll never get out of that cycle. So these blockades really were a way to reclaim that narrative and say, no, we're going to build internally. We're going to build our own community. And I think that is what is interesting about this moment, and what could persist and what could really take this crisis in a positive direction, which is to say that local leaders have emerged in communities. Ideas have sprung up within the community about how could we organize? How can we create our own library, our own spaces for youth? How can we make sure that our community is empowered? And that's a space that has been reclaimed. So why the blockades? It was because of this need to reclaim one's own future and control over that fate.
Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add to that a lot of youth that are organizing are also trying to see what is going to end up from these protests. They are really trying to create a movement that will outlast the mass protests that we've seen dying down anyway. They want a transformation in their neighborhoods because they have been burdened by illegal economies, by unemployment, by violence. And what you've seen is communities that are coming together and fundraising to create libraries, like others have said. They've created workshops and pretty much different things for their communities. And what I wanted to add too is that a lot of people have also said that if it weren't for the blockades, they wouldn't be able to start negotiations with the mayor in Cali, for example. They feel like the protests previously weren't powerful enough for them to start negotiations, and that the blockades have allowed for this to happen.
So, guests, I have a number of questions for you from our YouTube audience. I'm going to ask you the question. You're going to do an instant response, so we can get as many in as possible. Carlos says, next year, Colombia will have presidential and Congress elections. That will be a change for the people. Oh, will it? Nathalie, elections next year. Change, not change? Instant answer. Very quick. Go ahead.
I hope so. I think a lot of people are preparing for that. I think that there are people that are in the Blood Rose, in the Puno Resistance, are organizing each other to go to the voting polls, and also to be in the in the voting polls to see what is happening there.
Okay,
because
hopeful.
we know that we had
You're
a
hopeful,
corruption
Nathalie.
thing.
Liz Rainey
Yes,
is also watching. Liz Rainey said, kudos to you, Elizabeth. You make a great point. If the police perform during a wartime, they will take that mentality to the citizens. Could that be changed, Elizabeth? Very quick response, please.
I think it has to be changed for the effectiveness of the institution. With every day, they're losing credibility because of the way that the police are behaving in response to the very communities that they're meant to protect.
Mm-hmm. And one more, this is from Shivans. Shivans is on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of the show. What roles and activities are ordinary Colombians doing to support the protests, either indirectly or directly in schools, workplaces, etc.? Christina, you take that one, because obviously with their violence on the streets, that must have a chilling effect for the demonstrators. What are you seeing?
I have seen a lot of disenfranchised youth organize to protect protesters during these marches. And so they have created sort of a front line to defend themselves. And that's also been an interesting development from these recent protests.
Sophia is in Bogota, and she has a really interesting take on what is needed right now. Nathalie, I'm going to ask you to respond to Sophia's response very quickly. Here she is, first of all.
The most important strategy to achieve the change that protesters are demanding in Colombia is to listen to them. It may seem obvious, but the response of the government has been to send the public forces to dissolve peaceful demonstrations rather than dialogue. The few spaces for participation that the government has promoted have not been inclusive or representative, and there has no evidence of political will to comply with agreements. Second, it is important to have a long-term vision. Most of the problems that people are currently protesting are structural and have historical roots, so it is necessary to guarantee social and economic rights with public policies that go beyond the electoral swing and short-term approach.
Nathalie, you have demands from your government. What happens next?
When I was thinking about this, it's like nobody knows what is going to happen next, because every day, and because we are in such a diverse country and in such a diverse city, every day things can change. And every day that we see the response from the government, things just switch a little bit. I think it's something that is really important. It's not only the youth that is protesting. At least here in Cali, we can see the elderly, we can see children protesting, we can see like people my age, which is not that young. So I think it's like very unexpected what is going to happen. But I think this is going to be something that is a long-term run, you know? It's something that is not going to resolve in a month or in 2 months. It's something that is going to be here for a while. But the major problem is what this person was saying, is that the government is just not dialoguing, and it's not implementing anything. They didn't implement the peace agreement, so they're not gonna do anything from here. But we're just gonna keep fighting back. That's something that we can assure, that we're gonna keep fighting back.
There's one day I'm looking at, which is July the 20th, when Congress comes back into work. And I am wondering whether that might be the date where the National Strike Committee, where the demonstrators, the protesters are giving their demands to Congress. In a sentence, Elizabeth, what are your expectations?
So mass protests have already been called again for the 20th of July, and I think it's very possible that we see the movement gain momentum once again. This idea of dialogue is crucial, and it hasn't happened yet. And it's not only national dialogue, at sort of a national level among the elites talking to themselves, which is what it historically is in Colombia.
Sure.
This has to reflect the reality of the protests, which is decentralized at a local level and listening to the street.
Elizabeth, Nathalie, and also Christina, thank you so much for being part of our show today. If you want to follow them and you want to follow their expertise, have a look here on my computer. You can find Christina, you can find Elizabeth, and this is Noise Radio, which is part of the organization that Nathalie is part of. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, YouTube, for your comments and questions. I'll see you next time. Take care.